As a world-leading IP holder, Nintendo has been a primary beneficiary of Japan's Cool Japan initiative, which designates anime, manga, and video games as national cultural assets and core industries for economic growth. Japanese media IP is folded into their national strategy. The Cabinet Office's new Cool Japan initiative outline sets a 20 trillion yen overseas content target by 2033. What about in the US, though? Senator Slade Gorton served on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the oversight committee for the U.S. intelligence community, giving him access by virtue of office to classified intelligence materials and placing him inside the Senate's formal oversight structure for U.S. intelligence. He also later became a 9/11 Commission figure. So this was a high-level guy that sat right at the junction of terrorism, intelligence failures, and national security reform. Gorton had helped pass legislation that helped Yamauchi's Nintendo battle intellectual piracy. In the late 80s and early 90s, Nintendo faced an existential threat, not from Sega, but from copyright infringement. Counterfeit cartridges from Taiwan and Hong Kong threatened to erode the company's monopoly. Nintendo needed the force of U.S. law to crush these operations. Slade Gorton became the legislative battering ram for this cause. Nintendo of America is a massive economic force in Washington state. Gorton shepherded anti-piracy legislation that aligned Nintendo's corporate interests with U.S. trade policy. By framing video game piracy as a theft of American jobs, despite the IP being Japanese, Gorton helped deploy U.S. Customs and the FBI to protect Nintendo's margins. This relationship established a powerful quid pro quo. Gorton protected Nintendo in the halls of Congress, and Nintendo eventually came to Gorton's aid when his state faced a cultural crisis. In late 1991, the Seattle Mariners were on the verge of being sold by owner Jeff Smulyan to a group that intended to move the team to Florida. Local efforts to raise capital had failed. Losing the team would have been a humiliation for Washington's political class. Senator Gorton personally drove to the Nintendo of America headquarters in Redmond to meet with Minoru Arakawa, the Nintendo of America president, and Howard Lincoln, their chairman. He pleaded for help. Arakawa called his father-in-law, Hiroshi Yamauchi, in Kyoto. According to the Seattle Times, on Christmas Eve, Gorton got word that Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi would buy the whole team. Yamauchi, an austere man who had likely never seen a baseball game and had no interest in the sport, agreed to fund 60% of the purchase, $100 million, immediately. He framed it as a gesture of goodwill to the city that hosted his U.S. operations. The proposal triggered an immediate visceral reaction from the U.S. establishment. It was 1992, the height of Japanophobia. American media was filled with anxieties about Japanese economic superiority and the purchase of Rockefeller Center and Universal Studios. MLB Commissioner Fay Vincent and the ownership committee staunchly opposed the sale. Their argument was nationalistic. Baseball is an American institution and should not be owned by foreign nationals, particularly absentee owners in Kyoto. Under MLB rules, the owners could reject any buyer for any reason. The deal appeared dead. Nintendo did not negotiate. They escalated. Utilizing their political assets, they threatened the very existence of Major League Baseball's business model. Senator Gorton and Speaker of the House Thomas Foley publicly threatened to revoke MLB's antitrust exemption if the sale was blocked. This exemption, a legal anomaly granted by the Supreme Court in 1922, allows MLB to operate as a legal monopoly. Revoking it would destroy the league's ability to control franchise locations and player contracts, costing the owners billions. The message was clear: let us buy this team, or we will destroy your legal protection. Sports Illustrated reported that Gorton and House Speaker Thomas Foley had vowed that if Seattle lost the team, Congress would take a close look at MLB's antitrust exemption. Basically, approve this or expect federal heat. The Washington Post describes the bid as being watched as a symbol of tense U.S.-Japan trade relations. And it notes that MLB's ownership committee included George W. Bush, then Texas Ranger owner. Chuck Armstrong, the Mariners president, needed to fracture the MLB ownership committee's resolve. Armstrong called the future president and asked for his support. He then went a step further, asking if George W.'s father, President George H.W. Bush, could weigh in. In a Seattle Post Intelligencer column, Mariners president Chuck Armstrong, as quoted there, describes lobbying MLB owners he knew, including George W. Bush, who committed himself to helping the bid get judged fairly, and Armstrong says Bush would talk to his father. George H.W. Bush is also not just a former president. He was the director of the CIA in 1976 to 1977. The result was a phone call that Armstrong recounts with awe. One day the phone rang, and a woman said, "The president is calling." I asked, "President of what?" And she said a little icily, "How about President of the United States?" While the exact transcript of the call remains unavailable or unrecorded, Armstrong notes that both Bushes indicated they had no problem with the Japanese owner. Bush's administration was trying to encourage Japanese investment in the U.S. to offset the trade deficit. Nintendo was the perfect test case. Faced with the combined pressure of the U.S. Senate, the Speaker of the House, the President of the United States, and the threat of antitrust annihilation, MLB capitulated. To save face, the deal was restructured. Yamauchi retained the financial stake, but voting rights were nominally transferred to Howard Lincoln, the Nintendo of America chairman, to simulate local control. The Washington Post noted that George W. Bush's committee was key to clearing the deal. Nintendo is also largely responsible for giving us the ESRB rating board. In late 1993, Senators Joe Lieberman and Herb Kohl launched hearings on video game violence, targeting games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. The industry expected Nintendo and Sega to present a united front to defend free expression. Instead, Howard Lincoln, Nintendo of America chairman, the same lawyer who worked the Gorton and Mariners deal, walked into the Senate and threw Sega under the bus. Lincoln realized that the Senate didn't actually want to ban games. They just wanted a villain. He decided to hand them Sega on a silver platter. At the time, Sega was winning the console war by marketing itself as cool and edgy. Sega does what Nintendo don't. Nintendo turned that strength into a liability. Nintendo had censored the SNES version of Mortal Kombat, replacing blood with sweat and removing fatalities. Sega's version was uncensored. Nintendo had already orchestrated a plan with Lieberman before the hearings. Blake J. Harris writes, although Senator Joe Lieberman and his former chief of staff, Bill Anderson, weren't the only ones in Washington sniffing around this issue of video game violence, they quickly became the most serious about getting the government involved. Perrin Kaplan, former vice president of marketing and corporate affairs for Nintendo of America, who had worked on Capitol Hill prior to joining Nintendo, still had contacts in DC and was informed about what was going on. This was much more than Arthur Pober talking about whispers. These were distinct conversations going on in the shadows, and this made Kaplan intent on educating Senator Lieberman about what Nintendo did. So she invited him to come visit Redmond. Kaplan expertly worked to assuage any doubts he had about making the trip west, and any lingering concerns were likely erased by Senator Slade Gorton of Washington, who had worked with Nintendo on the Mariners deal and was also a close friend of Senator Lieberman. Once the plans were made, Lieberman and members of his staff visited NOA headquarters and got a crash course on Nintendo and the kinds of games that the company produced. Kaplan talked about how Nintendo had resurrected the industry through meticulous quality control, how NOA vigorously vetted and sometimes censored its games to ensure a wholesome quality, and how Mortal Kombat was a great example of the difference between Nintendo and its primary competitor. This was not a slight on Sega, but merely the facts, and Senator Lieberman appreciated the information enough to roll up his sleeves, pick up a controller, and spend some time trying out the Super Nintendo. Sounds like a photo op to me, but a Vice piece also quotes Kaplan admitting that Nintendo leaked Night Trap to some press ahead of time because they wanted to remain the wholesome company. That is not neutral behavior. That is active narrative shaping before Congress ever sat down. Howard Lincoln testified to the Senate, "I want to state that Night Trap will never appear on a Nintendo system." He framed Nintendo as the responsible corporate citizen and Sega as the purveyor of filth. He effectively told the senators, "We aren't the problem. Those guys in the black leather jackets are the problem." Sega tried to defend itself by unveiling its own proprietary rating system, VRC, that they had voluntarily created. They thought this would show responsibility. Lincoln dismantled this by pointing out that a rating system doesn't matter if the hardware manufacturer allows pornographic content like Night Trap on their device in the first place. When Sega's vice president, Bill White, tried to show a compilation of violent video games to contextualize the issue, Lincoln interrupted to point out that all the violent clips were from Sega games, not Nintendo games. It was a master stroke of legal rhetoric. Harris writes, "The longer this went on, the worse things got for Sega's Bill White. Some of it was due to Senator Lieberman's continual praise of Nintendo, which he felt had been a damn sight better than the competition." So Lieberman is framing the issue already as market competition and already biasing the outcome and saying that Nintendo is doing much better in this than Sega. So he comes across as biased from the start, especially after already visiting their headquarters. Howard Lincoln wasn't just a suit, he was a shark. Just like with the Mariners deal, where they used Gorton and Bush to bypass MLB rules, here they used Lieberman and Cole to bypass market competition. The hearings damaged Sega's reputation with parents right before the critical holiday season. It forced the creation of the ESRB, which neutralized Sega's edgy marketing advantage by putting warning labels on everything. So this was probably the end game that Nintendo, working with Lieberman, already had. They said, let's create a rating system that already is biased in favor of Nintendo. And who knows how that even plays out when you look into it, which I haven't. Well, other than this final example here of some kind of various types of hypocrisy. So, for example, Lincoln had famously said that Night Trap would never be on Nintendo. Well, in 2018, for the game's 25th anniversary, Night Trap was released on the Nintendo Switch. Also, fans think Nintendo censored Mortal Kombat because they were protecting children. The reality is they censored it so they could use it as political ammunition to destroy Sega in the Senate, Once the hearings were over and the ESRB was established, Nintendo released Mortal Kombat 2 on SNES with all the blood and gore intact. It was never about morality, it was about winning.
Flipping Hanafuda cards, dodging all the gambling heat. Built a whole new lane, made the government retreat. 8089 vision, took it to the digital scene. Lockout, chip, tactics, yeah, you know just what I mean. Antitrust hearings, man, that's just a light flex. Putting rivals on the ropes, making power plays with checks. This ain't conspiracy, it's the playbook plain to see. From a Kyoto card deck to a global dynasty.